if there's a choice between a man and a woman, they have equal qualifications, you take the woman.
Right.
Or you go out and really make sure that you've got a pool that has some women in it to start with. This was a time that affirmative action was really coming into universities.
Hello, I'm Jed Macosko, and I'm from academicinfluence.com and from Wake Forest University. And I have as a special guest today, Louise Lamphere from University of New Mexico. And she's coming to us to talk today about her background in anthropology and some of the things that led her into the field of anthropology and the things that she's done, because she's one of the most influential anthropologists today. So it's good to have you, Professor Lamphere.
Sure.
So tell us a little bit about how you got your start and what things led you into anthropology as a field.
Okay. Well, I grew up in Denver, Colorado, from a family that's been in Colorado for quite a while. And I was actually born in St. Louis, but I was an undergraduate at Stanford and was a sociology major.
Oh, okay.
But I felt it was sort of I don't want to say boring field, but I just felt it wasn't really, it was sort of a little bit distant from real people. So I did have this one experience of doing a survey where we went to different houses and asked people about their, political concerns or something. And that was pretty interesting because you get to see the different levels of income and stuff, people in fancy houses and people in, not so fancy houses. But when I was about a sophomore or junior, I read Ruth Benedict's Patterns of Culture, which really turned me on to anthropology. And I thought, wow, this is really interesting because it's a book that's about Native American people, the Pueblos, the Northwest Coast peoples, and the Plains people. And I thought they have such different approaches to life. And I thought, well, but this is really getting at these interesting cultural, differences. And I ended up going to graduate school at Harvard in a department called Social Relations, which started after World War II and only lasted until 1972. But the reason it was so appealing is I did have professors who were graduates of SOCREL, we used to call it. But the thing is, it was a four-field department. It had sociologists, social anthropologists, clinical anthropologists, and social psychologists.
Oh.
So you got this exposure to a broad piece of the social sciences, and the traditional anthropology department, which is still at Harvard, had archaeology and physical anthropology, and that stuff didn't interest me nearly as much as the kind of cultural or social anthropology. So, and then these connections with psychology and particularly with sociology. And the next major thing that was really important was I went on a field school, which is an incredible way to kind of get to know how to do what anthropologists do as field work and get exposure to another culture. And I think there's still field schools available for cultural anthropologists. Archaeologists do these every year because
I've heard about them. Yes.
Part of you can't do archaeology without digging things up or surveying the ground, and that's what you learn in these field schools. But for cultural anthropologists, it's really a way of understanding how other people live, and getting skills like interviewing people and understanding, how to study where people live and look at their economy or whatever you want. So I spent a summer on the Navajo reservation, actually in a kind of off-reservation community, and I thought, boy, this is a great culture because it was so different from ours. But I liked and was very attracted to parts of it. They have a great deal of emphasis on autonomy, for example. They have a very interesting religious system. And so that's where I ended up doing my fieldwork for my dissertation. It was not in Rama, but on the major Navajo reservation in New Mexico. But that's kind of what got me into anthropology, this whole experience to other cultures and, kind of, because anthropology's core idea in cultural anthropology is really understanding what we used to call the other, but it's understanding what other people think and not try to judge it and say this is bad or this is good or whatever, but kind of trying to get their point of view. And that carries through no matter whether you're working in the United States or not. But it's this ability, to qualitatively talk to people, to do what we call participant observation. In other words, you do things with people, you're participating, but you're also observing stuff, and you're learning how to take field notes. And through that experience, which is much different than doing a survey in anthropology or in sociology or looking at quantitative data or just doing interviews, because you spend a lot of time with people and you really, eat their food, you learn how to cook their meals like they do. You do things with people, on their Navajo reservation, I spent a lot of time driving people to, stores and, the local trading posts or to see neighbors or something like that. So you just do a lot of stuff with people, but you get to understand their life in a little more a closer way than you would in any other discipline.
Yeah, and that's what attracted you, it sounds like, from starting in the field of sociology, moving to cultural anthropology and really getting in with the people in the Navajo reservation. And then what did you do after Harvard? Where did you go after that? Did you start a teaching?
Well, I had a one-year job at the University of Rochester.
Okay.
I got my PhD in 68, but 67, 68, I did have this one-year job. And then I got a job at Brown University.
Okay, well, tell us about that. Yeah.
Yeah, this was a really interesting window because anthropology started expanding in, I'd say, the kind of early 60s. Most anthropology departments were part of sociology departments. And the other thing is there was a big explosion in state universities and community college campuses and so forth. And anthropology became a kind of in field that students really were interested in that kind of like late 60s, early 70s. And so courses began to expand. Anthropology departments broke off from sociology and founded their own departments. So for a while there was a bunch of jobs. And then about 19 in the early 70s, it started to break down because we had one of our first big recessions in like 73, 74. And so the jobs became a little bit scarcer, but I got a job right there in, 68. And, I had 4 job interviews and 4 offers and
wow.
But a couple of years later, it just wasn't there.
Yeah.
And the department, the discipline has gone up and down in terms of jobs that are available for people, but it was a kind of exciting time to enter the field.
Yeah. And, well, tell us a little bit more about what happened at Brown, because we know you were embroiled in a controversy while you were there, and that kind of shaped your life as a kind of milestone for you.
Well, I went there, and it was a joint anthropology sociology department. There were a small number of anthropologists, but we were very chummy with each other. I was the only woman. Well, the wife of one of my colleagues taught some courses. And then eventually around 72, we hired a woman to head our museum. But basically, it was all guys. But there were, wives and partners and people like that. So we spent a lot. And this bunch of anthropologists, we were the folks, the guys all wore turtlenecks and, dressed more informally than the sociologists who were wearing ties and shirts. This was sort of the beginning of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. So our department was very kind of chummy and, we used to go out to bars together and sit in people's houses and, have afternoon cocktails and so on. So we were a very friendly group. And then, the sort of anti-war movement comes along a couple years later. A lot of things were happening at Brown that were really important in terms of changing the institution. When I first got there, they passed what they call the new curriculum. And it was a couple of undergraduates that put this thing together. And the idea was to, first of all, you could have classes without grades.
Mm-hmm.
Second of all, you could make your own major.
Mm-hmm.
And then you could also, a group of students could get together and find a faculty sponsor and have their own course.
Yeah.
And you didn't have to do, 4 courses a semester. You could actually graduate with a couple less than that.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a very flexible thing. And Brown at the time was at the bottom of the Ivy League. It was a guys' school, but it had Pembroke at next door, which of course was harder to get into because the ratio was like, 2/3 guys and 1/3 women, but they were in different places, but they had the same faculty.
Mm-hmm.
So the Pembroke women were really smart and good scholars and so on. And the guys tended to be fraternity guys. And, lots of them wouldn't date Pembrokers because they were too intellectual or something. So one of the first things that happened was they integrated the two in 1970. And that was about the same time that the U.S. was involved in the Vietnam War and had just gone into Cambodia in the spring of 70. So we had a big student strike. And the junior faculty, a lot of us, participated in these things along with the students. And sort of out of that couple of years, a group of us started getting together because people had connections with folks in New York and learned about feminism. And we started having consciousness raising groups and, doing something to build what might become women's studies and also, get a sort of place for a women's center. So all this stuff was going on at one time because Pembroke became part of Brown the same year as the strike. And, they didn't have a regular graduation. The students decided they wanted to run graduation. So they ran their own graduation. They had their own, instead of having a formal dance on the green, everybody came in jeans and just had a good time. So this was the kind of change that was sort of continuing to happen in this period. And through reading groups and a consciousness raising group, a group of us started to do things like, teach a class, one of these independent studies were called, kind of a course that we formed,
right.
But the idea would there be a lot of student participation and so forth. So we tried that for one semester, and I started teaching classes on women, and then sort of in conjunction with that, a friend of mine from graduate school, Michelle Rosaldo, was at Stanford. She and her husband Renato had gotten jobs at Stanford, and actually he got a job, and then they sort of argued that, well, can't you do both of us? And so they got 1.5 jobs and split it. But anyway, she and a bunch of graduate students and faculty wives at Stanford taught a course in, I think, the spring of 72 on women. And they gave a session at the anthropology meetings, which were in New York, I believe. And I said to Shelley, after I listened to the papers in this session, I thought, wow, this is really great. Maybe we could put together a book. And so we started working. I used my network and she used her network, and I recruited some people, through my Brown connections or my, Harvard connections, to put in things. And she used the Stanford people plus other people she knew. And so we started putting together this Women, Culture, and Society book, which was finally published in the spring of 74. At the same time, a gal named Raina Ryder was working with people at Michigan, and her book was coming out with a monthly review press just about the same time. But we had a hard time finding a publisher because, first of all, publishers didn't want to publish collections. They wanted whole books by somebody. And second of all, we were junior scholars and didn't know anybody. But Shelley finally was able to convince the Stanford people that this would be a good idea. So we got a contract with Stanford, and we got the thing together and published it. Well, this was at the same time I was coming for tenure. The rules, of course, are that you are hired for 3 years, you get a renewal, then you get another 3 years, and in your 6th year, you come up for tenure.
Right.
And So by that time, my Navajo book was in press based on my dissertation, which was done on the Navajo reservation. And, I had several articles and I thought I was in pretty good shape.
Sounds good. Yeah.
But Brown had also been going through an economic crisis. Oh. It had to do with the price of heating oil, among other things, but it was sort of not a great time for the economy in general. But anyway, they started to have, kind of limitations on how many tenured slots every department had. But we got 2. And there was another colleague of mine, Niels Brera, who was coming up for tenure in the same year. So there was at least room for us. But by that time, we had split off from the sociology department. We got a new building because Brown had bought up a nearby college campus. And we got the library to turn it into a classroom, seminar rooms.
Wow. We
had about 1 classroom in the place, but it's a lovely building. It's a terrific building. So we had just moved into that. And so when I came up for tenure, I thought, things are okay. I've been teaching classes and I thought I had, lots of graduate students I was working with. But it was very unclear what the rules were, when I was going to put in a dossier, how many people were going to write outside letters, did I get to choose them, et cetera, et cetera. So I talked to my chair, Phil Lease, who was, one of our kind of drinky buddies. Yeah. But he said there were serious issues about my teaching. And I thought, what? Nobody's told me that before. And of course, we didn't have teaching evaluations. So I had no way of knowing. And it must have been some kind of hearsay from, one of my graduate assistants or something. So anyway, I decided, well, I'll do some teaching evaluations. So I did them for the fall semester, but I was still unclear about, when they were going to make a decision, what I had to give him. But I did get all my publications together and give them to him. And then I started, usually the graduate students were all asked to write letters. And so I went around to my graduate students and said, would you please write me a letter? And it turned out in the end, which I, of course, did not discover till about 1975 or 6, that Phil and another very close friend of mine, George Hicks, didn't really think they wanted to have me have tenure. And they also didn't, Niels had, a bunch of other problems and stuff. And so they were not going to support him. But at the time we had 6 full professors, all men. And it turned out the year I was up, there were 3 of them that weren't on campus. George was off on the Azores doing field work. A guy named Phil Dietz, Jim Dietz, famous archaeologist. He was off doing archaeological work. And then Dwight Heath, who was another cultural anthropologist, was not there. And so there were really only 3 people. But, Phil did get letters from people. He got a letter from Heath, and George wrote one. But the spring went on, and I thought, well, when am I going to hear anything? What's going on? Because I was pretty nervous after I'd had this conversation with Phil in the fall. And so finally, around early May, I'm still worried about hearing anything. And about a week before graduation, Phil calls me in his office, and he said that I wasn't going to get tenure. Oh my God. What's the problem? Okay. And he said, well, we thought your recent work on women was theoretically weak, and your teaching was poor, but not so much worse than others.
So it was all about the women.
So there I was.
Sounds bad.
And I walked out of that office. I thought to myself, I'm going to lose my job. I mean, this is my career. This is the discipline I love. I'm not going to. I've got to do something about this. Yes, so I did things like try to call the president. No, try to see the provost. Couldn't get any place. There was a very nice woman who was the vice president for academic affairs, but I couldn't really get to see her. I finally was able to catch her going from her office up to her house for some graduation was just around the corner. So she was some dinner with alumni or lunch with alumni. Mm-hmm. And she basically says, my hands are tied. I can't do anything. So I, wasn't sure what could happen, because by that time, what had happened is the department had written a letter to the provost, and the provost had ratified their decision. So that was that. So graduation came around, and Jane Dwyer, who was the other woman on the faculty, we had it out on the lawn in front of our department, and it was a lovely summer day. We had a nice punch bowl that Jane had put together with strawberries on the punch and so on. And so after all that, I went to said, Phil, can I talk to you for a minute in your office? So I went to his office and I said, look, I've hired a lawyer and I'm going to sue. Because by that time, I'd looked around to see if I could figure out what to do, and had found a law firm. So that was kind of that for a while. And the summer went on. By that time, I had been hooked up with Peter Evans, my lifetime partner. Mm-hmm. And he was in Brazil. So I went to Brazil for the summer. And this guy had hired a lawyer, didn't do anything over the summer. He was also running for office in the state for attorney general. And so nothing happened. So then I came back in the fall, and I turned out that it wasn't clear who was going to take this case, because he wasn't in this firm. Yeah. But finally, a guy named Milton Stanzler called me, and he turned out to be terrific.
Great.
And he said he would take the case. He was also a lawyer for the faculty union at the University of Rhode Island.
Oh, good.
And so knew about tenure, understood how universities worked, and is an incredible litigator. I mean,
great.
He can really pound somebody in court or in a deposition or something.
Oh, good.
Sharp guy, really amazing. Anyway, so it turned out that his nephew had come back to Rhode Island and was part of the law firm. And so Jordan, the nephew, Stanzler, did a lot of work on the case. And in the beginning, they decided first of all, we had to go through an internal grievance procedure.
Sure.
Because basically Milt says, look, if there's any grievance procedure, we need to do it, because what we're going to try to do is go to federal court and get a letter that says we can go ahead and sue. Mm-hmm. And if we've done internal procedures, we've got a better case.
Sure.
So we spent that year doing this internal review, which didn't get me any place. Nice bunch of faculty, but the problem was you couldn't, for example, charge discrimination, because the procedures only dealt with procedures. If something was wrong with the way they did the process, then you could have a grievance on that, but you couldn't do about discrimination. Although I threw in discrimination on the things I was unhappy about.
Yeah.
So we got a little ways on that. We got, basically, there were two things that the committee, the hearing committee, had found that were wrong. One was that the delay was so long, and there was some other issue. So I got a rehearing by the group of administrators above the provost, which were the other top administrators, including the president. And of course, that was totally pro forma, and they said they were just going to ratify what the department had done anyway. But by that time, we had filed in federal court in May of, that would have been 75. Mm-hmm. And Jordan, I think it was Jordan's idea, but Jordan and Milton decided that they would do a class action. Now, I mean, it wouldn't be about me, but it would be about discrimination against women at Brown, period, as faculty members. So it took a year for the class action to get decided, because a judge has to decide whether we could have a class action, and it wouldn't be just an individual case. And the judge we ended up getting, there were two federal judges on the bench, and this guy, Raymond Patine, was fabulous.
Oh, good.
I mean, I was very lucky because I had a terrific lawyer, a terrific judge, a university that was going through, some financial crisis and, couldn't afford huge lawsuits. And it was kind of a perfect storm in that sense, because a lot of the lawsuits that were filed by women in that same period, because the reason we could do it was the Title VII began to apply to universities about 1970.
Oh, wow.
So this was, or 72 maybe, but this was 74, 75. And so people were beginning to bring these lawsuits, and very few of them got very far. But mine was probably the most successful in the country, maybe.
Well, just getting to sort of the punchline, then you got the case decided. And I think I remember you telling me that, that Brown had to, for 10 years, create a committee to make sure this wouldn't happen to other people.
That's right.
And then it got extended for another 5 years after that because they couldn't quite get their act together.
Right.
So for 15 years, you helped protect people from that kind of discrimination. It
really ended up transforming the university. The reason we were able to settle this was because we got a new president, Howard Swearer, who didn't want, a $1 million lawsuit when he was trying to raise money.
Yeah.
But the settlement took a long time, but we got out of it something called a consent decree. And the consent decree gave 3 of us tenure, because there were 4 women that came, 3 other women that came in the case, and one of them was just an assistant professor, and she kind of got a 3-year salary. Mm-hmm. But 3 of us got tenure.
Good.
And then we were able to lay out all these procedures that everybody had to go through in terms of hiring, contract renewal, tenure, promotion to full. But the folks that were over, we got this committee called a monitoring committee, which was made up of 2 people I chose, 2 people the faculty chose, and then the 4 of them chose. And they looked at everything that came through the door, so to speak. And we got this thing to last for 10 years.
And then 5 more.
The thing that was really important was we set goals and timetables, which meant this is based on how many women were in what discipline. So they could be higher in English than they were in physics. But the idea was that every department would make an effort to hire women. And of course, it wasn't that we were like not doing this fairly, but the idea is if there's a choice between a man and a woman, they have equal qualifications, you take the woman.
Right.
Or you go out and really make sure that you've got a pool that has some women in it to start with. This was a time that affirmative action was really coming into universities, but usually the affirmative action official for the university had hardly any power. But this consent decree really gave women faculty some power. The other thing is, if you were part of the class, a faculty woman at Brown, somebody who would apply to Brown, you could come and charge discrimination, and they would hear there was another committee that kind of heard these cases.
Wow, that's wonderful.
So, the university fought all this tooth and nail. Like when it came to, giving people raises and stuff because they felt they'd been discriminated against, the committee would do something. And then the university would say, no, too much money, we'll cut that down. But it really,
you had somebody who could help out. Somebody to go.
But it really made a huge difference, because in that period, between 77 when we settled the suit and 92 when it was finally removed, because by 87 we really hadn't gotten to the goals and timetables. The idea was 57 tenured women by 87. Oh. That was the magic number. Okay. And we got to about 52 or something.
So you got
like
another
that.
5 years after that.
And so we got another 5 years, and it got much closer.
Perfect. Well, where did you go after all this? So you got tenure in 77, thanks to this decree. Then now you're in New Mexico. So what happened between then and now?
Well, for a while there, I didn't have a job. So I got a job in New Mexico, which, of course, since I grew up in Colorado, and since I'd done my field work on the Navajo reservation, was like coming home.
Okay.
And, Albuquerque, New Mexico is a city, but it's not as big as Denver. And so it seemed like a much homier-like place.
Yeah.
And the other thing was much, much more multicultural. I mean, because there's a huge Hispanic population, and there's, Pueblo reservations and Navajo reservations, a lot of indigenous people in the state. And so the student body is pretty diverse. And it was a public institution, which I come to really feel is terribly important. And so I came here, and then we got the case settled. And for a while there, I kept putting off going back because first of all, I got a sabbatical, which is usually what you get when you get tenure, but I was a few years late there. And I started a project out here on women who work in factories. And, so I finally went back in 79. But then it was pretty uncomfortable because my old friend George was then head of the department. So I was not exactly on speaking terms with him. And by that time, Howard Swearer decided this consent decree was very burdensome, and, he just assumed get rid of it. So I felt like I couldn't ever do anything there. Like I wouldn't ever be able to be department chair. I wouldn't be able to have some position in the Pembroke Center. I felt, and I, had the chance to come back here because I kind of kept my position rolling a little bit. And so they had a couple of people that left the department, so there was an opening, and so I decided to come back here.
And you've been there ever since?
Yep, until I retired in 2009, but I still have an office and hanging on by a little toehold.
Well, what would you say to people who are thinking of majoring in anthropology as undergraduates, particularly women or people who are from cultures and genders and things that aren't represented as much in academia? What would you say to those people?
Well, I think one of the things is anthropology itself has really changed a lot, and especially the cultural part. And it's archaeologists and physical anthropologists too, because we're much more concerned with collaborating with our subjects and using them as partners rather than just subjects. And we're also, I think, in cultural anthropology, there's a big move to really look at what I call critical social issues. So like most of my students have worked in the U.S., like all of my work's been in the U.S., on things like, farm workers in California, immigration issues, and, detention of kids in detention centers who are are part of immigrant families, abortion rights, just huge amounts of issues that the anthropological qualitative approach is pretty important, because you can understand how people are experiencing things and what their ideas are about what's going on in a much more interesting way. And especially if you do what's called participative research or collaborative research, you engage the community or an institution to help to be the people who decide what's going to be studied. So you don't come in and say, well, I'm interested in your religion, I'm going to study your religion. You come and say, well, I'm a researcher, I'm interested in working with you. What's on your mind and what would you like to have me work on? One of my students worked with a Pueblo group that's down by El Paso, and wanted to study their casinos, but they said, no, we're really concerned about diabetes. So he said, okay, I'll work on diabetes. And so he, and usually in that case, you get a committee of people, or you train research assistants, and you give people feedback during the whole course of the research about what's going on, and they get to say, well, you should be doing this, or we like that, or what about this, and so on. So that's the way anthropology is in academia. But there's also a lot of opportunities to do this kind of stuff if you're outside academia. Museums, for one, but there are a lot of people start working for NGOs. And doing research around that. There's lot of people were doing oral histories. So there's plenty of opportunities for anthropologists, and we're trying to make more for people that are outside the discipline. Probably half the people that get PhDs in anthropology, and this has been true for at least 20 years, are not working in universities, because what's happened to universities is, rather than having, when people retire, they don't make another position for an assistant professor, they break it up into 5 adjuncts or something of the sort. So it's not been good for either teaching students or for people who are the teachers. But at any rate, it's hard to get academic jobs. But there are a lot of other possibilities and a lot of ways in which anthropologists can go on to have very interesting, careers based on that kind of training you get as an anthropologist.
Yeah. And that seems to be the real advantage of studying anthropology as an undergraduate, let's say, is you're learning how to listen to people and not judge their views.
That's right.
Just take those views in, listen to them, and try to make sense of them using the very same people that you're listening to as a guide to how to best make sense of all of it. So,
that's right.
Now, as a final sort of thought here, we live in a country that's probably more divided than it ever has been before.
Yeah.
And the way you were describing anthropologists, I thought, well, if everybody was an anthropologist, we wouldn't have this problem, because people would listen to each other.
People wouldn't feel so angry at immigrants, for example, if they could understand why immigrants came and but also what they do when they get here and how they're managing, and
they would have sympathy for that life and the life that the immigrants live. And then people who are mad at others for wanting to build a wall, down there in the south of New Mexico and Arizona and Texas, wouldn't maybe be as mad at the people who want a wall, because they would understand what the wall builders culture is and why they want the wall, and what see what I'm saying is it goes both ways, and so what can you tell the world at large about how to do that better, and give us some parting thoughts as we close out this interview?
Well, I do think it's an attitude, and I do think that there are people who can get that attitude outside the classroom, but it's very much an appreciation for the diversity of human life, which is what anthropology studies in the broadest sense. And it's very different than my way or the highway, so to speak. And I think a lot of people get it from other places, but it's really is super important for that kind of a perspective to get more kind of play, so to speak. So take an anthropology class.
Yeah, that's right. Everybody should take one. Maybe just listening to your interview and how you worked your way through the controversies and your career. I think it'll be inspiring to people. So thank you so much.
Okay, good.
Professor Lamphere. You did an amazing job explaining everything to us so clearly. We really appreciate it.
Okie dokie. Well, good. You're welcome.